Hello, everybody. Welcome. So many things on my mind and my heart at the moment. Past couple of days have been particularly strange. In ways, some of which are very troubling and some of which are possibly worthy of celebration. Or seemingly good. Yet I've become skeptical of the things that seem good because lately, I suppose I am perhaps beginning to learn to suspend the urge to determine whether something is good or not good or portends joy or suffering. I saw this afternoon a red-naped sapsucker. Not sure that I've ever seen one of those before. And here in the garden, the hawks have been making a racket. Of course, there are many philosophical traditions in which we are encouraged to withhold judgment. Perhaps Stoicism is one of these traditions. It's unusually cold here today, though here we are in late December, closing in on January. The new moon will be on the 2nd. Which is close, right, to harmony with the actual calendar. Yeah? I'm afraid this hood looks kind of silly in the video. There I am judging things. There's the old somewhat cliched story of the farmer. I don't know where the story originates, but a farmer is poor and has but one horse, and he lives in a small village. And I could have made him a female, but traditionally it's presented as a man. And one day his horse runs away. And in the evening, the villagers often gather together. And sometimes in the story it's at the farmer's house, but we can imagine that they gather in a gathering place where they sit around a fire or something like this and have something nice to eat or drink. They share food and drink. And so one day the farmer's horse runs off. And some of you surely know this cliched parable. Anyway, that night the villagers gather. You know, you could imagine that the place that they gather is something like this. except maybe without the cargo container, right? And maybe there's a fire pit in the middle. And the villagers mourn the misfortune of the farmer. Oh, it's terrible, your horse has run away, it was your only horse. How will you, do the work in the fields? How will you travel? Well, and the farmer says, well, maybe it's terrible. And they say, no, it's awful, we're all so sorry for you. And the farmer says, well, we'll see. And some days pass and they gather and they're bemoaning the loss of the horse every night, and the farmer's kind of not particularly decisive about whether this is good or bad. And a few days after this, the horse comes back with 4 other horses accompanying it, and now the farmer who lost his horse has 5 horses. And when the villagers get together, they celebrate, say, oh, this is wonderful, this is beautiful. You only had 1 horse, then you had no horses, now you have 5. This is fabulous. What incredible fortune. And the farmer says, well, we'll see. And some time passes. The farmer has a son who's about to come of age. And one day the son is working with the horses, and one of the horses kicks him and breaks his son's leg. And now, when the villagers gather at night, they say, oh, this is terrible, it's awful, your son's leg is broken. It seemed a good thing you had the horses, but now your only boy, his leg is broken. And the farmer says, yes, it's true. This is a terrible misfortune. And the farmer says, well, we'll see. About a week later, soldiers come to the village from the king, or the tyrant, and they gather up all the young men who are capable of fighting in the war, and they essentially kidnap them. But they can't take the farmer's son because his leg is broken. And the villagers gather together and say, it's great good fortune that your son cannot be taken by the soldiers. And of course the farmer, as usually does, he says, well, we'll see. And the problem with determining whether something is good or bad that's illustrated by this parable, which of course is obvious, so I hope you'll be kind in your judgment of me for being so didactic here. But the problem is that we cannot see into time, and also we cannot see beyond the often superficial concerns that fascinate and terrify and delight us. And so since we cannot see beyond these things, which we would immediately see if we could even see a little bit more deeply into time or relation, or if we knew anything deep about what it means to be alive, why we are here, what is life, what is birth, what is death, what is light, what is time, what does it mean to be an animal or a plant, what exactly is a living world for, what's it doing, why is time-space making organisms, all of these questions, right? If we had some reliable insight, not human representational insight, reliable insight into the nature of time-space or being or identity, then we might, well, if we had really good insight, we'd probably do away with the idea of good and bad altogether. And our relatively trivial, bipolar judgments would not only would they no longer be compelling, we'd be incapable of applying them to circumstances because we would see beyond time. There's another weird old apocryphal story. I'll give the greatly condensed version. A rabbi and an acolyte have certain agreements I'll leave these aside. The main agreement is that the acolyte does not interrupt or interpret or speak out when they are not together at the nightly fire. That's the only time the acolyte is allowed to speak. And they come across a scene in a river where a family's boat has overturned, and the family is attempting to save each other from drowning in the river. And as this is going on, an infant floats near enough to the rabbi who's standing on the shore that the rabbi could easily simply reach down and pluck the infant out of the water and save its life. The rabbi does nothing. The acolyte, yells at him. The rabbi probably strikes the acolyte in the face and admonishes him to be silent. And then later they're talking. And of course the acolyte says to the rabbi, why did you not save that infant? It was so simple. All you had to do was reach down into the water and grab the little child and it would not have drowned. And the rabbi is very severe with the acolyte and says, did you not agree to keep silent and observe instead of talking and thinking? And the acolyte says, yes, I did agree. Then why did you not do that? And the acolyte again repeats his concern. You should have saved the infant. It was right at your feet. All you had to do was reach down. And the acolyte says, yes, all I had to do was reach down. But unlike you, I can see into time. And if I'd rescued that particular infant, in a future time, because of that infant surviving, hundreds of thousands of people would have been tortured and killed in a horrible, needless war. Since you cannot see into time, why don't you keep silent and observe? Now, this is a very severe parable. It comes from Tales of the Hasidim by Martin Buber, a fabulous series of books. There's some of the racket I spoke of earlier. A really fabulous series of books for those of us who might be interested in the topics therein explored. And, one might think, well, I'm not Jewish. That's not the point. There's something profound to be learned from all of the mystical traditions that are truly ancient and trustworthy and deep in their roots, regardless of however distorted or confused some of the, farthest branches may become. I love many of these stories. I'm inclined to share another one. One day a young child comes crying to his grandfather, who's a rabbi. And the child says, he's just crying, he's inconsolable. And the rabbi says, my grandson, my beautiful one, what's the trouble? What's the trouble? And the grandson's crying and he says, my friend and I, we agreed to play hide and seek, and so I hid, and I hid well, but my friend did not seek me, and he just left me there, and he ran off. And the old man begins to weep, and crying himself, he says, oh, my beautiful grandchild, this is exactly the case with the Holy One. For the Holy One has done the same thing. He has hidden himself, and now, in our time, no one is seeking him. And so they cry together. and comfort one another. Something happened to me today that I've waited and hoped for 10 years. And I cannot tell if it is good or bad or terrible or meaningless or what it means. More than 10 years, probably. A little bit. In any case, I'm not sure what to make of it, though I'm comforted somewhat. But there are two topics that have been stewing in my mind for some time now. And I'll probably make extended videos about both of them. But I'm going to introduce, at least briefly, both of them today because I think they're very related to each other. Whether or not they are related to my circumstances is a more complicated question, but I think they are. The first is that, the one that I will pose first is the topic of boundaries. And we hear a lot about this in life coaching contexts and therapeutic contexts and psychological contexts. And all of that is well and good when it's well and good, when it's not something else, and sometimes it is something else. And we should be careful in thinking about these matters to be sober and not easily enchanted by the language or the ideas. Because in general, humans are far too easily enchanted by the language and the ideas. And so they lose their sobriety when presented with a topic, and suddenly everything takes on the appearance of this topic or this way of seeing. And now, in a manner of speaking, we've lost our minds, right? So the first topic is boundaries, and what I mean by boundaries is, what do we keep out of what, of where, right? Which contexts require that we protect them from intrusion in order to maintain coherence, health, well-being, intelligence, joy, healing, development, and so on. So, inside our bodies, there are bacteria of various myriad kinds. One of those kinds, E. coli, can present a lethal problem if it escapes its ordinary context into other parts of the body. Most of us have other kinds of bacteria, Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, that under certain conditions will kill us if the boundaries that ordinarily hold them at bay are relaxed or dissolve. So you can see in biology itself this very important feature that some things must remain properly distinguished from one another. Boundaries must be held and maintained and attended, and those boundaries sometimes transform, but the function of the boundary is crucial to the survival of the organism. You know, we have relatively distinct organs. They don't just melt into each other at night when we dream, the way that the organs of the caterpillar appear to do inside a chrysalis And yet I strongly suspect that within the chrysalis, even in the goopy mess, there's something that resembles boundaries between different liquefied assets, we might call them. Now, some cultures, human cultures, some religious cultures and some ethnic cultures, are extremely careful about certain kinds of boundaries. And I once wondered if there might be a good reason for some indigenous tribes, say, living deep in the jungle or on an island somewhere, if there might be a very important reason for them to immediately kill any human beings not of their tribe that showed up there. And there are good reasons for this. And one of those reasons is microbes. Apparently, when the Spanish showed up to colonize South America, they brought diseases that the indigenous people had no immune systemic experience of. And so some of those diseases decimated the indigenous populations. Not that, guns and horses and other kinds of nightmare problems wouldn't have decimated them anyway, and then similar kinds of things happened when the North American continent was colonized. Except that I don't know, I guess they were mostly British and French people who came here. I don't actually know for sure, but whoever the original colonists were in the North American continent, not the original colonists, those may have, I think we've lost the stories of the people who were here originally from other continents, because they didn't necessarily proceed with colonization. They may have landed, they may have traded with indigenous people. There's some speculation that there were various landings of different people before the colonization we're familiar with took place. In any case, during certain parts of the Indian Wars, it's well known that the colonists gave blankets infected with smallpox to the indigenous people. So they used microbes as a weapon. And that's a very cruel and vicious thing to do. And especially to weaponize the microbes while appearing to be giving aid. Yeah. And you can see how, if the indigenous people had held their boundaries or been capable of holding their boundaries against the interlopers, history might have turned out very differently. Because they were relationally more mature, some of them were willing to allow the colonists to interact with them, and they died for it, and were enslaved for it, and so on. Now, there are many other cultures, the Judaic cultures. One might imagine that these were once a nomadic people, besieged all around by the city-building peoples who both enslaved them and fought over their traditionally inhabited lands. And so, in order to preserve their traditions and their way of life and their tribes and their gene lines, right? They had to enforce very strict boundaries of various kinds, and occasionally behave with great viciousness toward their enemies. This is at least one way of thinking about things. Whether or not it's historically true is a different question. And over time, that leads to problems, right? Boundaries held too strictly, or boundaries held in forms that should have adapted and adopted new features over time, can become as dangerous as boundaries not held at all. Now, our own minds, we suffer as moderns from the cataclysmic interpenetration and almost arbitrary mixing of boundaries and contexts that should otherwise have remained at least relatively distinct. And this might have been one of the functions of both governments and religions. These days, it's one of the functions of corporations, too, which is a bizarre idea, but true. In fact, corporations are a bit like the mixture of a government and a religion. Or at least they can be usefully seen this way. So, we're living in a fucking mess. A clusterfuck of competing imperatives, attempted coups and dominations and excisions and excerpting and indictments and celebrations and so on, that's so confused and reckless that it's a bit like falling down the side of a mountain and then having a new cataclysm attached to you each time you tumble, so that in the first tumble you catch on fire, in the second tumble you're frozen solid, in the third tumble you're infected with 17 different kinds of bacteria, in the fourth tumble, you're hit by gunfire, in the fifth, and so on. And so, this is how it is to live in many people's minds and in our psyches in the modern time. And we wonder, well, why is everything so confusing and wrong and unhappy and unjust and so on? Partly it's because there's nothing to hold the line against any kind of incursion. So every kind of incursion that can possibly be imagined or enacted happens to us and becomes a part of our life all day long, every day. Nothing's holding the center anymore. Yeah? There's no center to hold. It's been obliterated by something resembling projectile weapons, except it's really nothing more than language, ideas, information, and images. Now, this is a terrible situation. In fact, even the farmer would probably agree, no, this is bad. Because now it's not even possible to stand back and remain impartial the way the farmer was trying to. No, even he would be overwhelmed in this kind of situation. Most likely. No, I could be wrong. At least in my present figure, he would be. The figure I am making. So, we must learn together and help each other to discover how to form intelligent boundaries and hold them with and for each other and for the history and future of life on Earth, and for the hope of something resembling human intelligence and authentic dignity and something more like wisdom than knowledge is. Because knowledge, especially technical knowledge, is primarily deployed against life on Earth and human beings, vastly more so than it is ever deployed to aid them. And so in our time, knowledge is itself a deficit, right? It's an impoverishment. Wherever it is not blatantly and obviously beneficent or a blessing. And this is in part why back at the tree in Genesis, the Holy One said, don't eat of this tree in the midst. Really important little phrase, in the midst of the garden. For it is death. And then later the serpent, actually an angel that divides things, in fact, who had divided something at that tree, at the midst tree, said, oh, you won't actually die. Oh, wow, what a mess that begat. My goodness. And it wasn't necessarily evil, it was just, it was the failure to maintain boundaries, actually, right? The boundaries between the angels and the young, maybe the form, the inner form of what would become the humans, right? Which perhaps Adam and Eve represent. Yeah, they don't necessarily represent physical humans here on earth. They are mythic beings in a parable that contains its own solution as a medicine, yet this is a hidden thing from humans that few of them will ever glimpse or understand. So the other topic that I will approach, and I hope to explore boundaries more deeply in a future video, the other topic is the necessary contrast and something of the conflict between that which is public and that which is private. Our interiority and our social exteriority. These are things that have to be kept carefully apart in many aspects of our modern existence, or disaster ensues. And these are precisely what the current trend of furious diseases we refer to as social media are mixing together on purpose. That will not only end catastrophically, every moment of its progress will introduce new diseases and new forms of harm and damage and compromise and enslavement and terror and addiction and spell casting and so on. So we should be very, very cautious about these things and treat them with great skepticism and careful, sober inquiry together. Well, it's getting a little bit dark. I have a few other things to attend this afternoon. So for now, I will thank you all for joining me. I welcome your questions. Please take a moment to sign in and like my videos or share them. And notice that I don't have any advertising in my videos. I don't allow advertising at all. So I depend on my viewers for whatever support they can, that they can feel comfortable in sharing with me, so that I can continue to make and publish my videos on YouTube. Part of why they get so few views is because I refuse to advertise. So I need your help a little bit. The links to my Patreon page are on my YouTube site, and I'm grateful to those of you who watch and comment and share on my videos. Thank you so much for your kind attention, your awareness, your intelligence, and your concern. May you remain warm and healthy through the winter months this year and all the winters of your life.